morning again, church.
Good morning.
My guess is that we all took grammar in grade school. Is that right? And for those who can remember that far back, you remember that in grammar we learned the parts of speech. There were nouns and pronouns, verbs and prepositions. And if you're old enough, which I'm not, you may even have been taught how to diagram a sentence. How many of you had the diagram sentence? Yeah, you are old. They don't do that anymore. Like in the sentence, the boy threw the ball, you would have identified that there were two nouns and one verb. The boy and the ball were nouns because they named a thing or a person. Threw was the verb because it expressed an action. And if you got really good at it, I won't talk for that, but you were able to indicate that in the sentence, the boy threw the ball. The boy was the subject because he was doing the action, the one who was throwing. And the ball was, well, you weren't that good. Threw the ball was the predicate, but the ball was the object, okay? Because it was the one being acted upon. It was the one being thrown. All of that from a 5-word sentence, the boy threw the ball. Ah, for the days when those were our biggest problems. In today's gospel from Luke, a scholar of the law asks Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" If you're going to be taking notes or following along with the homily notes, we are going to be looking at Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. Luke 10, 25 to 37. So, the scholar of the law or lawyer asks Jesus what he must do to inherit eternal life, and then an exchange occurs between Jesus and the lawyer about the law. And they talk about the two great commandments, the commandment to love God and to love neighbor. And Jesus tells him that this is what he must do to inherit eternal life. But the lawyer, of course, isn't satisfied with that. He has to prove himself and to test Jesus at the same time. So he asks, "And who is my neighbor?" And then Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, it's important to remember that he's telling this parable in answer to the question, who is my neighbor? And if you're like most folks, you're looking at neighbor as an object. Who am I supposed to love? and I'm supposed to love my neighbor. And so you listen to the story trying to figure out which of the characters is the one I'm supposed to love. So Jesus begins the story. A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. The victim, is he my neighbor? A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. The priest. Maybe he's my neighbor. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Could it be the Levite who is the neighbor? But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. Maybe the Samaritan is my neighbor. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, "Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back." Never thought of the innkeeper. Maybe he's the neighbor. Jesus just told a parable in answer to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" that gives us 5 possible answers: the victim, the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, or the innkeeper. Which one of them is my neighbor? You might think. But as Jesus is getting to the end of the story, he does what Jesus always does. He pulls a fast one. He throws a curveball. Because he asks the question, which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? That wasn't the question, Jesus. The question was, who was my neighbor? Not which one was neighbor to the victim. But you see, if you look at Jesus' question, what he has done is flipped it on us. You see, we think of neighbor as someone other than ourselves. We see ourselves as the subject and the neighbor as the object. And so we want to know which one is neighbor so that we know who we're supposed to love as ourselves. But by asking the question, which of these 3 was neighbor to the victim, Jesus has now just made the neighbor the subject of the sentence. It's the neighbor who is acting on another. Because for Jesus, the neighbor isn't the object, he's the subject. We're a neighbor because of how we behave towards others. The neighbor isn't someone else, we are the neighbor. And the question is, do we act like a neighbor? Jesus doesn't want to know who is my neighbor. Jesus wants to know, how am I neighbor to others? And he forces the lawyer to answer, the one who treats the other with mercy. And Jesus says, then go and do likewise. You see, the way Jesus looks at it, neighbor isn't somebody else on whom we act. The neighbor isn't the victim who is injured and then cared for. For Jesus, the neighbor is the one who shows mercy, the one who cares for the other. The neighbor is the Samaritan because he treats the victim with mercy. And for Jesus, we are the neighbor whenever we do likewise. And so again, for Jesus, the question isn't, and who is my neighbor? The question is, and how am I neighbor? And quite simply, he tells us, I am neighbor when, one, I care about another's situation. And two, I am equipped to bring healing to the situation. And three, when I enlist others to help. So you see, when we learn about the way immigrants are being treated at our borders, how families are being separated in order to be detained, how raids are expected this weekend right here in Baltimore, it's not a question of whether the immigrant is my neighbor. It's a question of how I am neighbor to the immigrant. Do I even care about what's happening to immigrants? Do I try to understand why people are coming to our country and how our government is responding to them? Or do I cross over to the other side of the road and ignore the issue? Because after all, I have enough problems of my own. You see, if we want to be neighbor, the first step is caring about what's happening to others. At least learning a bit about their plight. Because quite frankly, once we become aware of the problem, like it or not, we become accountable for our response. Next, then, we have to ask if we're equipped to bring healing to a situation when we encounter it. Notice how the Samaritan in the story already had oil, wine, and bandages on him. He traveled equipped to heal the situation at hand. And when we approach a situation ready to heal, then we can be neighbor in that situation. We talk a lot about wanting to support and encourage our youth and young adults in their faith. But do we approach them equipped to heal the situation? All too often, adults approach me and say, we should do this for our youth and our young adults. To which I often ask, and have we asked them whether they want that? You see, the tools for healing that we can all carry around with us are the tools of listening to and accompanying others, of praying for them and even praying with them. These things, listening, accompanying, praying, are all the oil and wine and bandages we carry with us all the time. And in the end, we have to remember that we don't have to bring healing to a situation all by ourselves. We need to enlist others to help. Notice again how the Samaritan relies on the innkeeper to help heal the victim. The Samaritan has other tasks he has to address, So he enlists others to help him. And that's something we all have to remember. If we believe that we have to heal every situation all by ourselves, we'll end up doing nothing, because we'll become so overwhelmed by the world's problems that we'll just crawl in a hole and hide. That's why we have to be part of a church, or a neighborhood association, or a political party, or just a group of like-minded people. If we want to be neighbor to the children and families around us, to the young people who hang on our corners and streets, we need to be part of a larger group. We can't do it all alone. Even our church can't do it all alone. And that's why we're joining a group like Build, so that we can enlist others to help us be neighbors. So if you're taking notes today for the homily, our question for you this week is, how can I be neighbor to someone else? How can I care? How can I heal? How can I enlist others to help? How can I be neighbor? You see, a neighbor is not the object of our action. Immigrants and youth and young adults and children and families around us really aren't our neighbors, because that would make them objects. And Jesus is not interested in treating people as objects. Jesus wants us to be the subjects of our actions, the ones who do the acting, not the ones who are acted upon. He wants us to care, to be equipped to heal, to enlist others to help. That's how we are neighbors. Now go and do likewise. Amen.